Hey everyone, ever wondered what it really felt like to be a soldier in World War II? Not the textbook version, but the real voices, the real emotions, the stories straight from the battlefield? Well, today, we're diving deep into their world, the fear, the courage, and everything in between. Let's go back in time and hear the voices that shaped history.
As the war dragged into its third year, the battlefields were not the only places suffering. Entire nations had become part of the fight. Every factory, every farm, and every household was drawn into the struggle. This was no longer a war between armies. It was a war of societies, a total war that demanded everything a nation could give. In Britain, women took the places of men who had gone to fight. They worked in munitions factories, operated trams, and served as nurses near the front. Their hands built the shells that thundered across France, and the ships that sailed to supply the Navy. For many, it was the first time they had stepped into the roles once closed to them, and though the work was dangerous, it gave them a new sense of purpose and independence. In Germany, women and children toiled in fields and factories as well, struggling to keep the nation running under the crushing weight of the British blockade. Food shortages became a common enemy. In cities across Europe, bread lines stretched around corners. Ration books replaced coins, and families learned to live with less each day. In Germany, people ate what became known as war bread, made with potato flour, sawdust, and anything that could fill an empty stomach. In Britain and France, victory gardens sprouted in every spare patch of land. The hunger of civilians was as real as that of the soldiers in the trenches. Governments seized control of industries, economies, and information. Newspapers were censored, and propaganda filled every poster, film, and speech. Men were urged to enlist, women to work, and everyone to sacrifice for the nation. Posters showed smiling soldiers and proud mothers, hiding the grim truth of what the war had become. Yet propaganda also helped people endure. It gave them a reason to believe that all the suffering had meaning, that their endurance would lead to triumph. Technology also transformed civilian life. New methods of mass production fueled the war effort, but they came at a price. Explosions in munitions factories were common, claiming thousands of lives on the home front. In France, the war crept dangerously close, with towns near the front emptied and entire regions reduced to rubble. Refugees flooded safer areas, bringing with them stories of devastation. The emotional toll was immense. Families lived in fear of the telegram that might arrive at any moment, a simple message that meant a son, husband, or brother would never return. Cemeteries grew, and letters became sacred treasures, read until the paper wore thin. The idea of heroism was being replaced by exhaustion and grief. Still, the war machine demanded more. Taxes rose, savings vanished, and every resource was poured into the conflict. Even in faraway colonies, people were drafted into the effort. African and Indian soldiers fought under European flags, while laborers from Asia were shipped to France to dig trenches and build roads. The Great War had reached into every corner of the empire, uniting millions under a single, relentless purpose: survival. By 1917, morale was crumbling. Strikes erupted in factories, protests filled the streets, and the hope of victory began to fade. In France, weary soldiers refused to charge once more into certain death, sparking mutinies that shook the army. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, hunger and fatigue turned once proud citizens into desperate survivors. Across Europe, the people who had cheered for war in 1914 now prayed only for peace. The war had consumed not just soldiers but entire civilizations. It blurred the lines between front line and home front, between soldier and civilian. Every life was measured in rations, every heartbeat tied to the fate of the war. By now, the world understood that victory would not be won with glory or courage alone. It would be bought with endurance, sacrifice, and an unending will to survive. By 1917, the war had reached a breaking point. The great empires of Europe were exhausted, their armies drained, and their people starving. Millions were dead, and still the lines on the map barely moved. The Allies desperately needed help, and far across the Atlantic, a new power was rising to take its place on the world stage. The United States, once determined to stay out of Europe's chaos, could no longer ignore the storm that threatened to consume the world. For years, America had watched the war from a distance. Its factories supplied food, weapons, and equipment to the Allies, while President Woodrow Wilson promised neutrality, but neutrality was becoming impossible. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships without warning. In early 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, declaring that any vessel, enemy, or neutral was a target. American ships were torpedoed, and the deaths of U.S. citizens outraged the nation. Then came the final spark. British intelligence intercepted a secret message from Germany, known as the Zimmermann Telegram. It proposed an alliance with Mexico, promising to help it reclaim lost territories in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if the United States entered the war. When the message was made public, outrage swept across America. The illusion of safety was gone. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. At first, the American army was small and inexperienced, but the nation's vast industrial strength and manpower would soon tip the balance. Factories across the United States shifted to war production. Millions of men were drafted, trained, and shipped overseas, while American women worked tirelessly in hospitals, offices, and assembly lines. Within a year, American soldiers, known as the Doughboys, were arriving in France by the thousands. Their presence breathed new life into the weary Allied armies. Fresh, confident, and full of energy, the Americans brought supplies, strength, and hope. They marched through villages, where the people cheered and waved flags, symbols of a long-awaited change in fortune. On the front lines, they faced the grim realities of trench warfare, but their determination was undeniable. Battles like Cantigny, Château-Thierry, and Belleau Wood proved that the Americans could fight and win. At Belleau Wood, when ordered to retreat, a U.S. Marine famously replied, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." Meanwhile, in the skies and at sea, American pilots and sailors joined the struggle, escorting convoys across the submarine-infested Atlantic and fighting dogfights over Europe. The tide was slowly turning. German morale faltered as the blockade tightened, and the promise of victory faded into despair. The entry of the United States also reshaped the politics of the war. President Wilson presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a messenger of peace. In January 1918, he announced his 14 points, a vision for a new world order built on diplomacy, national self-determination, and a lasting peace without vengeance. To many, it sounded like hope in a world drowning in destruction. But the war had not yet ended, and the cost would still rise higher. With American troops reinforcing the Western Front, the Allies prepared for a final push. Germany, desperate for victory before the full weight of the U.S. could be felt, launched one last massive offensive in the spring of 1918. For months, the fighting raged across northern France, cities changed hands, and thousands more fell. Yet the momentum had shifted. NBY, the summer of 1918, the German army was breaking. The Allies, now strengthened by over 2 million Americans, began to push forward relentlessly. The thunder of artillery grew louder, the skies filled with aircraft, and the trenches that had stood for years began to crumble. The arrival of the United States did not end the war overnight, but it ensured that the outcome would never be the same again. The balance of power had shifted forever. A new force had entered the world stage, and the final act of the Great War was about to begin. By 1918, the great empires that had once ruled the world were collapsing under the weight of their own war. 4 years of blood, hunger, and loss had drained their strength. The German army was still powerful, but its spirit was breaking. Austria-Hungary was coming apart from within, the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating, and Russia had already fallen into revolution. The war that began with empires would end with their destruction. On the Eastern Front, Russia's story had taken a tragic turn. The February Revolution of 1917 forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, ending centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government tried to continue the war, but the soldiers and people were done fighting. In October, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power and promised peace. In early 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering vast territories, but freeing themselves from the conflict. The Eastern Front fell silent, and German troops moved west, determined to win before the Americans could fully arrive. That spring, Germany launched its last great gamble, the Spring Offensive. It was a massive assault designed to break the stalemate once and for all. German forces surged across the Western Front, pushing the Allies back with terrifying speed. The old front lines vanished as towns fell and trenches were abandoned. For a brief moment, it seemed Germany might win the war. But victory came at a cost they could not afford. Supplies ran low, soldiers starved, and morale crumbled. The Allies, reinforced by fresh American divisions, regrouped and struck back. By the summer of 1918, the tide had turned. In the Second Battle of the Marne, the Allied forces halted Germany's advance and began pushing them back. The relentless counteroffensive that followed became known as the 100 Days. The Allies advanced through shattered villages and ruined fields, reclaiming land that had been fought over for years. German soldiers, hungry and disillusioned, began to surrender in droves. At home, Germany was unraveling. Strikes and protests spread through the cities. The once proud empire faced starvation and revolution. Sailors mutinied in Kiel, and workers marched in Berlin demanding peace. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The German Empire was no more. In its place, a republic was declared, born not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Across Central Europe, the old order was collapsing. Austria-Hungary splintered into new nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, defeated in the Middle East, began to dissolve as Arab uprisings and Allied forces swept through its lands. In the deserts of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence and Arab fighters captured key cities, striking a blow that ended centuries of Ottoman rule. The Middle East was being reshaped, its borders redrawn by those who had never walked its sands. By autumn, Germany's allies were falling one by one. Bulgaria surrendered first, then the Ottoman Empire, and finally Austria-Hungary. Isolated and surrounded, Germany had no choice. At dawn on November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France, an armistice was signed. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. Across the front, soldiers emerged from their trenches, dazed and uncertain. Some cheered, some wept, and others simply stared at the empty horizon. The war that had begun with such confidence had ended in ruin. The world was quiet for the first time in 4 years, but the silence felt strange, heavy with loss. In the aftermath, the numbers were almost beyond comprehension. More than 10 million soldiers were dead, millions more wounded or missing, and countless civilians had perished from hunger, disease, and bombardment. Towns were reduced to rubble, families shattered, and entire generations scarred. The victors were exhausted, the defeated broken. No one truly won. As the smoke cleared, the old world was gone. Monarchies had fallen, borders were erased, and a new era was beginning. One built on the ruins of empire, and the fragile hope that such horror would never happen again. The Great War had ended, but its shadow would stretch far into the future. The war was over, but peace did not come easily. Across Europe, the guns had fallen silent, yet the land still groaned under the weight of ruin. Fields once green were now wastelands of craters and barbed wire. Cities lay in ruins, and millions wandered with nowhere to go. Refugees searched for homes that no longer existed, and soldiers returned to find a world that could never understand what they had endured. The victors and the defeated alike faced a single haunting question: what had it all been for? In Paris, the leaders of the Allied nations gathered to decide the future. The Treaty of Versailles would be their answer, a document meant to secure lasting peace. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with his vision of a fair and just world, guided by his 14 points and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But the mood in Europe was far less forgiving. France, scarred by years of invasion and loss, demanded punishment. Britain sought to protect its empire and maintain its power. The result was a fragile compromise, one born not of unity, but of exhaustion. Germany, forced to accept full responsibility for the war, faced harsh terms. Vast territories were taken away, its colonies seized, and its army reduced to a fraction of its former size. Most painful of all were the reparations, enormous payments that crippled its economy and humiliated its people. To many Germans, the treaty felt like a betrayal, a wound that would never heal. Among the ruins, resentment began to grow, quietly waiting for its time to return. Elsewhere, the collapse of empires gave birth to new nations. Poland rose again after more than a century of disappearance. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were born from the fragments of Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire vanished, replaced by the newborn Republic of Turkey and the drawing of artificial borders across the Middle East. In Russia, the civil war raged between the Red and White armies, shaping the future Soviet Union. The world was rearranging itself, not with harmony, but with confusion and fear. The League of Nations was created, a hopeful attempt to unite countries in diplomacy rather than war. But without the United States, which chose to withdraw from global affairs, the League's power was weak. Its promises of peace sounded noble, yet the world was too fractured, too wounded, to fully believe. For the generation that had fought, the return to normal life was impossible. Those who survived carried invisible scars. They were called the Lost Generation, men who had seen the worst of humanity and could never forget it. The poetry of the trenches, written by soldiers like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, captured the disillusionment of a world that had once believed in honor and progress, only to find itself drowning in mud and blood. Monuments rose in cities and villages across the world, bearing the names of the dead. Families placed photographs on mantles, medals in boxes, and prayers in the wind. Every nation grieved. Every home bore an empty chair. The silence that followed the war was not peaceful. It was heavy, aching, filled with ghosts. The Great War had promised glory but delivered grief. It had redrawn borders, destroyed empires, and reshaped the balance of power, but it had not ended conflict. In its wake, anger and despair festered. Economies faltered, nationalism hardened, and the seeds of another war began to take root. Within 20 years, the world would once again be at war, bigger, deadlier, and darker than before. Yet even amid the ruins, there was hope. The war had shown the terrible cost of hatred and pride, but it also revealed the strength of endurance and the resilience of the human spirit. From the ashes of the old world, a new one struggled to emerge, one determined, however imperfectly, to build something better. The Great War was more than a conflict of nations. It was a turning point in the story of humanity, the moment the world lost its innocence. It ended empires, reshaped societies, and forever changed the way we understand war itself. Though a century has passed, its echoes remain, in every soldier's memorial, in every field once fought over, and in the fragile hope that the lessons of that terrible time will never be forgotten. You're about to discover how the world flipped upside down in the early 1900s, when one spark in Europe set off a chain reaction that pulled nations across the globe into chaos. World War I wasn't just battles and trenches. It was a story of courage, invention, and massive change. From old empires collapsing to new powers rising, this was the war that reshaped everything. So buckle up. We're diving into the Great War like you've never seen it before. Now let's get into it. You're about to discover how one spark in 1914 set the world on fire. World War I changed everything: nations, technology, and history itself. Let's get started. Wait, did you know World War I started because of one assassination and ended up involving over 30 countries? It introduced tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons for the first time, forever changing warfare. Over 16 million people lost their lives, and the map of the world was redrawn. It all began with one shot and reshaped history forever. Let's continue watching. So what did we learn from World War I? Well, a lot. Alliances went wild, new weapons changed everything, and women stepped up like never before. Propaganda took over, empires fell, and the world would never be the same again. Crazy, right? Let's continue watching. Pine trouble and tout de rad. So World War I all started from one bullet. One guy got shot and boom, the whole world's at war. Crazy, right? They called it the Great War, cause no one thought there'd be a sequel. Spoiler alert, there was. Soldiers lived in muddy trenches with rats and explosions. Total nightmare. But get this, on Christmas 1914, both sides stopped fighting and played football. Yeah, an actual wartime soccer match. And shout out to Cher Ami, the heroic pigeon who got shot but still saved 200 soldiers. MVP with wings. The Great War changed everything. New tech, new nations, and a whole new world. Wild times, right? And that's how World War I changed the course of history, a war that began with one shot and ended by reshaping the world. From the ashes of empires came new nations, new ideas and lessons that still echo today. History was never the same after that. Thanks for watching. And until next time, keep exploring the past that built our world.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Cities lay in ruins, nations were exhausted, and millions of soldiers began the long road home. Yet peace after so much war was not simple. For those who survived, the battle did not end with victory. It only changed shape. The men who had faced the horrors of combat returned to a world that had moved on without them, a world that could never fully understand what they had seen or lost. Across Europe, soldiers walked through towns they no longer recognized. The streets were broken, the buildings hollow, and the faces of civilians were marked by hunger and grief. Some soldiers returned to find their homes gone, their families displaced, or their countries divided. Others were greeted as heroes, but even parades and applause could not erase the memories that haunted them. Many could not sleep without hearing the echo of artillery. The smell of smoke, the cries of the wounded, and the faces of fallen friends followed them everywhere. In America, the returning GIs stepped off ships to cheering crowds and waving flags. The war had made them symbols of courage and sacrifice, but behind their smiles were invisible scars. Many struggled to adjust to normal life. They found themselves waking in the night, reaching for rifles that were no longer there. Some couldn't bear loud noises or crowded rooms. They were alive, but part of them was still out there on the battlefield, trapped in moments that time could not heal. Yet from their pain came determination. The post-war years would see them build families, study under the GI Bill, and help create a new world powered by hope and industry. They wanted to believe that their suffering had meant something, that the peace they fought for would last. In the Soviet Union, millions of soldiers returned home to a nation both victorious and devastated. Entire cities had been erased from the map. The Red Army's triumph was immense, but the cost was beyond comprehension. Mothers searched for sons who would never return. Some soldiers came back to nothing but ashes, their families gone, their homes destroyed. Yet they carried themselves with pride, knowing they had helped to break the back of tyranny. They had defended their homeland and endured what no one should ever endure. But the wounds of the Eastern Front ran deep, and for many, the war would live on in silence and memory. In Germany and Japan, the end of the war brought a different kind of return, one shadowed by guilt, loss, and reckoning. German soldiers came home to a defeated and divided land, their uniforms stripped of meaning. Many were taken as prisoners, forced to confront the crimes committed in the name of their flag. They faced not only the destruction of their nation, but the moral weight of what their war had wrought. In Japan, soldiers returned to a country shattered by fire and atomic devastation. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone, and the emperor's voice had declared the unthinkable: surrender. For the first time in generations, the soldiers of Japan laid down their arms and faced the reality of defeat. Some wept openly, others bowed in silence, unsure of how to begin again. For the families who waited, reunion was bittersweet. The joy of seeing a loved one again was often tempered by the realization that they were no longer the same. Fathers came home to children who did not recognize them. Brothers returned to find empty chairs at the table. Wives embraced men who smiled but spoke little of what they had seen. The war had changed everyone, leaving no heart untouched. Some soldiers could not speak of it at all, burying their memories deep within, while others told their stories so the world would never forget. In hospitals and recovery centers, the wounded filled endless wards. Some had lost limbs, others their sight, and many their peace of mind. They learned to walk again, to live again, surrounded by nurses and doctors who became their new comrades. Prosthetic limbs replaced what war had taken, but no invention could replace what was lost inside. Yet even in their pain, they found moments of strength, shared laughter, small victories, and the quiet understanding between men who had survived the impossible. The world began to rebuild. Factories that once made weapons now produced tools and machines for peace. Bombed cities became symbols of renewal. Berlin rose from its ashes, London repaired its scars, and Tokyo began again. The soldiers who had once destroyed now helped to create, laying bricks and planting seeds where craters once stood. Across continents, a generation scarred by war began the work of peace, driven by the memory of what they had endured. Some soldiers kept the letters they had carried through the war, stained with dirt and tears. Others preserved helmets, medals, or faded photographs. These were their reminders of friendship, sacrifice, and the fleeting moments of humanity that survived, even in the darkest days. They told stories to their children, not of glory, but of endurance, loyalty, and loss. And in those stories, the voices of their fallen brothers lived on. Years later, when they grew old, many would gather at memorials and monuments, standing in silence before rows of names carved in stone. They saluted, not for victory, but for memory. They remembered the cold mornings, the fear, the laughter in the trenches, and the faces of those who never came home. The war had shaped them, defined them, and haunted them. But it had also taught them the value of life, of peace, and of each fleeting moment under the sun. For the soldiers of World War II, the battlefield never truly disappeared. It lived on in dreams, in memories, and in the lessons passed down through generations. Their courage rebuilt a broken world, and their voices, soft, weary, and honest, reminded the world that freedom, once won, must never again be taken for granted. In the years that followed the end of World War II, the echoes of battle faded, but the lessons endured. The soldiers who had once faced each other across fields of destruction became the architects of a fragile peace. They had seen what hate could do, and though the scars of war never fully healed, they helped shape a world determined not to repeat its mistakes. The guns had gone silent, but their stories of courage, sacrifice, and survival continued to speak through generations. The late 1940s and early 1950s were years of rebuilding and reckoning. Nations rose from ashes, their people driven by both grief and hope. Soldiers who had marched through cities in flames now returned to build new lives among the ruins. In Europe, the Marshall Plan brought life back to broken economies. Roads were rebuilt, factories reopened, and children returned to schools where lessons once stopped because of air raids. Former enemies became allies, bound together not by war, but by the shared desire to never see another like it. In Germany, a generation of young men and women faced the painful truth of what their nation had done. Former soldiers worked alongside those they had once fought against to rebuild a country divided by walls and memories. They carried guilt and loss, yet many also carried a determination to create something better. The Wehrmacht veterans, once proud of their discipline and loyalty, now lived quietly, often avoiding discussions of their past. But in private, some wrote letters and diaries, trying to make sense of what they had seen and done. Their words revealed not only remorse, but also a longing to understand how humanity had fallen so far. In Japan, the transformation was profound. The same soldiers who had once marched under the rising sun now labored to rebuild a shattered nation. They planted rice in fields scorched by war, rebuilt cities turned to dust, and watched as democracy replaced empire. The emperor's surrender speech had marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new identity for Japan. Soldiers returned to their families with humility, teaching their children about endurance, respect, and the futility of blind obedience. The old code of Bushido gave way to a quiet devotion to peace, craftsmanship, and progress. Across the Soviet Union, victory had come at a cost beyond measure. Entire generations were gone, and cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad had become sacred ground. Soviet veterans returned as heroes, yet many bore wounds that no medal could heal. Some spoke with pride of their victory over fascism, while others could not forget the faces of those lost to hunger, cold, and relentless battle. The government celebrated their strength, but behind the parades, the human cost lingered. Still, they rebuilt, factory by factory, field by field, driven by a fierce belief that their suffering had secured a better future. In America, the soldiers of the greatest generation returned to a nation ready to prosper. The war had ended the Depression, and now industry, science, and culture flourished. Veterans went to college, bought homes, and raised families. Yet beneath the optimism, many carried silent battles. Some awoke in the middle of the night, their hearts racing to the rhythm of remembered gunfire. Others found solace in community, at local bars, in veterans, halls, and at memorials where they could finally speak the truth only fellow soldiers would understand. They didn't call themselves heroes. Most would simply say they did what had to be done. Across every continent, remembrance took root. Monuments rose in the places where soldiers had fallen. Normandy's beaches, once red with blood, became quiet fields of white crosses and stars. In Poland, Auschwitz stood preserved as a warning to the world. In the Pacific, rusting shipwrecks and silent jungles held the bones of forgotten soldiers. The world began to remember not just the victories, but the people who made them possible, the ordinary men and women who had carried extraordinary burdens. Time softened the memories, but it never erased them. Veterans grew old, their hair turning white, their medals gathering dust in boxes. Yet when they spoke, the weight of their words was timeless. They told their grandchildren about friendships forged under fire, about sharing rations in the cold, and about the strange beauty of dawn after a night of chaos. They spoke of fear, yes, but also of courage, the kind that comes from standing beside another human being and refusing to let go. As the decades passed, the world they had saved changed again. The Cold War replaced open conflict with silent tension. New generations grew up without knowing the sound of air raid sirens or the sight of bombers overhead. But the veterans remembered. They gathered on anniversaries, in uniforms that no longer fit, saluting the ghosts of their youth. They knew that their sacrifices had built the foundations of modern freedom, but they also knew that peace was fragile, something to be guarded, not assumed. The legacy of the soldiers of World War II lived not in the medals or the monuments, but in the lessons they left behind. They taught the world that unity could defeat tyranny, that courage could outlast fear, and that peace was worth every hardship. They proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, light could endure. As the last veterans passed, their stories were written down, their faces preserved in photographs, their words echoed in museums and documentaries. The world they left behind was imperfect, yet far better than the one they had inherited. Every nation, every generation owed them a debt, not for fighting, but for reminding the world of what must never happen again. And so, their voices live on, in the wind that moves through the fields of Normandy, in the still waters of the Pacific, and in the quiet prayers whispered beside old memorials. They were soldiers once, but more than that, they were witnesses to the cost of freedom. Their courage shaped a century, and their memory endures, not as soldiers of war, but as guardians of peace.